Power, privilege, and hidden cameras. When the walls of an elite estate become witnesses to a shocking breakdown, one woman's courage stands between scandal and salvation. In a world where reputation is everything and secrets are currency, sometimes the most dangerous moments happen when no one thinks they're being watched. What unfolds in the shadows of wealth and influence will test loyalties, expose hidden truths, and prove that even in the most controlled environments, human nature can spiral beyond all boundaries. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Ashworth Manor, its golden rays filtering through the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over the estate for centuries. Margaret Ashworth stood at the tall windows of the drawing room, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing patterns on the condensation that had formed on the glass. At 62, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades in the public eye, every gesture calculated, every expression measured. The manor had been in her late husband's family for generations, a sprawling testament to old money and older traditions. Since Charles's death 3 years ago, Margaret had transformed from the supportive wife of a prominent businessman into the formidable matriarch of one of the country's most influential families. The weight of maintaining the family's reputation, their extensive business interests, and their carefully cultivated public image rested squarely on her shoulders. Today was particularly significant. The annual charity gala for the Ashworth Foundation was only weeks away, an event that would bring together politicians, celebrities, and business leaders from across the nation. The foundation, established in Charles's memory, had become Margaret's obsession, a way to cement the family legacy and ensure their continued prominence in high society. Elena Morrison moved quietly through the corridors of the manor, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpets that adorned the floors. At 28, she had been working as Margaret's personal assistant for almost 2 years, a position that had evolved far beyond the typical secretary role. Elena had become Margaret's confidant, her strategist, and often the voice of reason when the older woman's ambitions threatened to overshadow her judgment. The job had its challenges. Margaret Ashworth was not an easy woman to work for. She demanded perfection in all things, from the arrangement of flowers in the grand foyer to the precise wording of press releases. Her standards were impossibly high, her patience notoriously short, and her temper, while rarely displayed in public, could be devastating behind closed doors. And Elena had witnessed these private moments, the volcanic eruptions of frustration when things didn't go according to plan, the cutting remarks delivered with surgical precision, the way Margaret could reduce grown men to stammering apologies with a single withering look. Yet Elena had also seen the vulnerability beneath the polished exterior, the moments when Margaret's mask slipped to reveal the grief-stricken widow still struggling to find her place in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. The security system at Ashworth Manor was state-of-the-art, installed shortly after Charles's death when Margaret had become increasingly paranoid about their safety and privacy. Cameras monitored every entrance, every corridor, every public space. The system had been designed by Harrison Security, a firm that specialized in protecting high-profile clients. Elena often wondered if the cameras were meant to keep threats out or to keep the family's secrets in. James Harrison himself had overseen the installation, a quiet man in his early 30s whose military background was evident in his bearing and attention to detail. That he had served 2 tours overseas before transitioning to private security, and his reputation for discretion had made him the preferred choice for wealthy families who valued their privacy above all else. What most people didn't know was that James had also installed a hidden monitoring room in the manor's basement, accessible only to Margaret and himself, a precaution, he had explained, in case the main security system was ever compromised. The hidden room contained backup servers and monitors that captured everything the main system recorded, creating a redundant archive of footage that could prove invaluable in case of an emergency. Margaret had agreed to the installation, though she rarely visited the room herself, leaving the technical aspects to James while focusing on the broader picture of family security. On this particular morning, Elena noticed that Margaret seemed more agitated than usual. She had been pacing the drawing room for nearly an hour, occasionally stopping to make sharp clip phone calls that left whoever was on the receiving end scrambling to accommodate her demands. The charity gala was consuming her thoughts, and Elena could see the familiar signs of an impending breakdown. The guest list alone had been revised 17 times in the past month. Margaret insisted on personally approving every single attendee, cross-referencing their social standing, their potential value to the foundation, and their likelihood of making substantial donations. She had rejected senators' wives for wearing the wrong designer, excluded business leaders who hadn't supported her husband during his lifetime, and demanded detailed background checks on any new faces who might grace their carefully curated event. Elena's phone buzzed with another frantic message from the catering company, asking for clarification on Margaret's latest dietary restrictions for the guests. Margaret had decided, seemingly overnight, that the menu needed to accommodate not just the usual array of allergies and preferences, but also the specific dietary philosophies of several wellness influencers she hoped to attract to the cause. The caterers were struggling to create a menu that would satisfy both the traditional tastes of their usual attendees and the avant-garde requirements of the new demographic Margaret was courting. The florist had called twice that morning, nearly in tears over Margaret's rejection of their third proposal for the centerpieces. Margaret wanted something that would convey both elegance and innovation. Something that would photograph beautifully but wouldn't obstruct conversation. Something that would complement the manor's historical architecture while signaling the foundation's forward-thinking approach. Elena had tried to mediate, but Margaret's vision seemed to shift with each conversation, leaving vendors frustrated and Elena caught in the middle. As the morning progressed, Elena began to notice subtle changes in Margaret's behavior, but the older woman's usual precision was giving way to erratic decision-making. She would demand immediate action on one matter, only to completely reverse course an hour later. Her conversations became more intense, her gestures more animated, and her expectations even more unrealistic than usual. The phone rang again, and Elena watched as Margaret's face darkened while she listened to the caller. It was the venue coordinator for the gala, reporting that one of their major sponsors had withdrawn their support at the last minute, citing concerns about the foundation's recent investments. The sponsorship was worth over $200,000, money that Margaret had already allocated in her budget projections. Margaret's response was swift and fierce. She demanded to know who had influenced the sponsor's decision, insisted that Elena immediately investigate the foundation's recent press coverage, and began making a list of people she suspected of sabotaging the event. Her paranoia, usually kept in check by her strategic thinking, was beginning to surface in ways that made Elena uncomfortable. The afternoon brought more challenges. A prominent social columnist had published a piece questioning the transparency of the Ashworth Foundation's finances, suggesting that too much of the donated money was being spent on administrative costs rather than charitable programs. The article wasn't particularly damaging. It raised legitimate questions that most foundations faced, but Margaret reacted as if it were a personal attack on her integrity and her late husband's memory. Elena spent hours on damage control, reaching out to friendly journalists, coordinating responses from the foundation's board members, and trying to prevent Margaret from making any public statements while she was in such an agitated state. Margaret's usual media savvy seemed to have deserted her. She wanted to respond immediately and forcefully to what she perceived as an attack on everything she had worked to build. By evening, the situation had escalated beyond anything Elena had previously witnessed. Margaret had canceled 3 important meetings, berated 2 staff members until they left in tears, and fired the event planning company they had been working with for months. She was now insisting that Elena take over all aspects of gala coordination, despite Elena's protests that she lacked the experience and connections necessary for such a massive undertaking. The security cameras throughout the manor captured every moment of Margaret's deteriorating state, though at the time, no one was actively monitoring the feeds. James Harrison was off-site, updating security protocols for another client, and the regular security staff knew better than to comment on the family's private moments. The footage accumulated silently in the system's servers, creating a detailed record of a woman slowly losing control of the carefully constructed world she had built around herself. Elena found herself walking a tightrope between loyalty and self-preservation. Now, she had signed multiple confidentiality agreements when she took the job, binding her to absolute secrecy about the family's private affairs. Margaret had been generous with both salary and benefits, providing Elena with a lifestyle she could never have afforded otherwise. But as the day wore on, Elena began to question whether her loyalty to Margaret might be putting others at risk. The manor's staff had begun to whisper among themselves, sharing concerned glances when they thought no one was looking. Margaret's behavior was affecting everyone. From the groundskeepers who had been berated for imaginary problems with the landscaping, to the kitchen staff who had been subjected to increasingly unreasonable demands about meal preparations. The atmosphere in the house had become tense and unpredictable, with everyone walking on eggshells to avoid triggering another outburst. As night fell over Ashworth Manor, Elena sat in her small office adjacent to Margaret's study, reviewing the chaos of the day and trying to develop a strategy for damage control. She could hear Margaret on the phone in the next room, her voice growing louder and more agitated with each conversation. The Foundation's board members were being subjected to late-night calls filled with accusations and demands for immediate action on various perceived slights and sabotage attempts. Elena realized that tomorrow would likely bring even greater challenges. Margaret had scheduled back-to-back meetings with potential donors, interviews with society reporters, and a site visit to one of the Foundation's sponsored programs. In her current state, Margaret was likely to alienate everyone she encountered, potentially destroying relationships that had taken years to build and putting the Foundation's future at risk. Security. The security system continued its silent vigil, cameras recording every moment as the crisis unfolded within the walls of Ashworth Manor. Data realized how important that footage would become, or how the events of the following day would test every relationship, every loyalty, and every assumption about power, privilege, and the price of maintaining a perfect public image. Dawn broke gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over Ashworth Manor like a heavy blanket. Elena arrived early, hoping to manage some of the crisis before Margaret began her day, but found the older woman already in her study, surrounded by scattered papers and empty coffee cups. Margaret had clearly been awake for hours, possibly all night, and the strain was evident in her disheveled appearance and the manic energy that seemed to radiate from her small frame. Berger was on the phone when Elena entered, her voice sharp and commanding as she spoke to someone who was clearly receiving the full force of her displeasure. Elena caught fragments of the conversation, something about loyalty, betrayal, and consequences that would be swift and severe. When Margaret finally ended the call, she turned to Alan with eyes that burned with an intensity that was both brilliant and deeply unsettling. The first meeting of the day was with Victoria Pemberton, the elderly widow of a shipping magnate who had been one of Charles Ashworth's closest friends. Victoria had been a reliable supporter of the Foundation, contributing generously and lending her considerable social influence to their cause. Elena had arranged this meeting weeks ago, hoping that Victoria's presence would help stabilize some of the Foundation's recent challenges. Victoria arrived precisely on time, as was her custom, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of understated wealth and refined taste. At 78, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of high society. Elena greeted her at the front entrance and led her to the morning room, a smaller, more intimate space that Margaret preferred for important conversations. During like a force of nature, her energy crackling with barely contained intensity, she embraced Victoria with a warmth that seemed genuine but carried an undertone of desperation that made Elena uncomfortable. Margaret immediately launched into a detailed account of the Foundation's recent achievements, speaking rapidly and jumping from topic to topic in a way that left little room for Victoria to respond. Elena positioned herself discreetly near the door, ready to assist with refreshments or documentation as needed, but also increasingly concerned about the direction the conversation was taking. Grace had been replaced by an almost aggressive enthusiasm that seemed to overwhelm Victoria, who was struggling to keep pace with the rapid-fire presentation of facts, figures, and future plans. The conversation took an alarming turn when Margaret began discussing what she termed enemies of the Foundation, people who she believed were actively working to undermine their mission. She spoke about the withdrawn sponsorship with a level of vitriol that suggested personal betrayal rather than business concerns. Victoria's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable as Margaret's accusations became more specific and more paranoid. Elena watched in growing horror as Margaret began showing Victoria printed emails and documents that she claimed proved a conspiracy against the Foundation. The papers appeared to be routine business communications that Margaret was interpreting through an increasingly distorted lens. Victoria's attempts to offer reasonable explanations for the situations Margaret described were dismissed with escalating irritation. The breaking point came when Margaret accused Victoria herself of being part of the conspiracy, suggesting that her late husband would be ashamed of her disloyalty to the Ashworth family. Victoria's shock was palpable. her face paling as she struggled to process the sudden attack from someone she had considered a friend. Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized that Margaret had just alienated one of their most important allies. Victoria stood with as much dignity as she could muster, her voice trembling slightly as she expressed her disappointment and concern for Margaret's well-being. She suggested that Margaret might benefit from some rest and perhaps professional support, comments that only inflamed Margaret's anger further. Victoria left the manor without the usual pleasantries, her departure marking the end of a relationship that had spanned decades. Elena spent the next hour trying to manage the fallout from the disastrous meeting while simultaneously preparing for the day's remaining appointments, palaces, and attempt damage control. But the response was coolly professional. Victoria would be reassessing her involvement with the foundation and would communicate her decision through her lawyers. Margaret seemed oblivious to the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was already focused on the next meeting, convinced that her confrontation with Victoria had been necessary and justified. Elena realized that Margaret was losing the ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate responses to stress, a development that could have catastrophic consequences for both the foundation and the family's reputation. The afternoon brought James Harrison to the manor for his weekly security briefing day, hoping that his calm, professional presence might have a stabilizing effect on the increasingly chaotic situation. James had always been someone Margaret respected, one of the few people who could speak frankly with her without triggering defensive reactions. James arrived with his usual punctuality, carrying the tablet and security reports that were part of his routine check-in. Elena met him in the foyer and briefly explained the situation, hoping he could help her assess whether Margaret's behavior had crossed the line from stress to something more serious. But James listened with the focused attention that had made him so effective in his military service, asking pointed questions that revealed his growing concern. Margaret greeted James with unusual intensity, immediately launching into a detailed account of the security threats she believed the Foundation was facing. She wanted the security system expanded, additional cameras installed, and background checks conducted on everyone who had access to the manor. Her requests were not entirely unreasonable given the family's profile, but the urgency and paranoia behind them were deeply troubling. As Margaret led James through her concerns, Elena noticed that her behavior was becoming even more erratic. Margaret was speaking faster, gesturing more dramatically and making connections between unrelated events that seemed to exist only in her increasingly agitated mind. James maintained his professional demeanor, but Elena could see the concern growing in his eyes. And the situation escalated when Margaret demanded immediate access to all security footage from the past month, convinced that reviewing the recordings would reveal evidence of the conspiracy she believed was targeting her foundation. James explained the technical and privacy implications of her request, but Margaret's response was to question his loyalty and suggest that he might be part of the problem. Elena watched in alarm as Margaret's accusations became more personal and more vicious. She was attacking James's competence, his integrity, and his commitment to the family's security. James, to his credit, remained calm and professional, but Elena could see the tension building in his jaw and the careful way he was choosing his words. The confrontation reached its peak when Margaret demanded that James provide her with copies of all security footage immediately, threatening to terminate his contract if he continued to obstruct her investigation. James attempted to explain the legal and ethical boundaries that governed his work, but Margaret was beyond rational discussion. Elena made a decision that would have consequences she couldn't yet foresee. Diak. She stepped forward and gently suggested that Margaret might benefit from a break, offering to handle the security discussion and follow up with James privately. Margaret's reaction was explosive. She turned on Elena with a fury that was shocking in its intensity, accusing her assistant of disloyalty, incompetence, and betrayal. The verbal assault that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced in her 2 years working for Margaret. The older woman's voice rose to near shouting levels as she berated Elena for overstepping her boundaries, questioned her motives, and made personal attacks that were both cruel and completely unjustified. Elena stood frozen, shocked by the venom in Margaret's words, and the complete absence of the respect and appreciation she had thought she had earned. James watched this exchange with growing alarm, recognizing that Margaret's behavior had crossed into territory that was potentially dangerous for everyone. His training had taught him to identify situations that were spiraling out of control, and every instinct was telling him that intervention was necessary. The situation reached a crisis point when Margaret began making threats against Elena's future employment, against James's business, against anyone who she perceived as standing in her way. Elena felt tears stinging her eyes as the woman she had served faithfully for 2 years continued her assault, seemingly unaware of the damage she was inflicting on relationships that had taken months or years to build. James stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm as he attempted to de-escalate the situation. His military training had included conflict resolution, and he recognized the signs of someone who was no longer in full control of their actions. Margaret's response was to turn her fury on him, accusing him of insubordination and demanding that he leave the property immediately. Elena found herself caught between her loyalty to Margaret and her growing realization that the older woman was spiraling into a state that was potentially dangerous for everyone around her. The security cameras continued their silent documentation of the crisis, recording every word, every gesture, every moment of the breakdown that was unfolding in real time. As the day progressed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Margaret fired 2 more staff members, canceled the remaining meetings on her schedule, and barricaded herself in her study with strict instructions that she was not to be disturbed. Elena and James found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to manage a crisis that seemed to have no clear resolution. The manor fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of Margaret's voice from behind the closed door of her study as she made increasingly agitated phone calls to board members, journalists, and anyone else who would listen to her conspiracy theories. Elena and James realized they were witnessing the complete breakdown of someone who had spent years maintaining perfect control over every aspect of her public and private life. The third day of the crisis dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down on Ashworth Manor like a gathering storm. Elena had spent a sleepless night in one of the guest rooms, unwilling to leave the estate while Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate. James had remained as well, ostensibly to monitor the security situation, but actually out of growing concern for everyone's safety. Margaret had not emerged from her study since the previous afternoon's confrontation, though the sounds of her increasingly frantic phone calls could be heard throughout the night. Elena had tried several times to check on her, bringing meals that were left untouched outside the locked door. The few responses Margaret had offered to Elena's gentle inquiries were sharp dismissals that made it clear she was not ready for any form of reconciliation or assistance. The morning brought news that confirmed Elena's worst fears about the expanding crisis. PA. Buckingham Palace came into substance. A Bucking town had submitted their resignations overnight, citing concerns about the organization's direction and leadership. 2 major donors had formally withdrawn their support, and a prominent society reporter had called asking for comments about rumors of instability within the foundation's management. Elena found herself in the unprecedented position of managing the foundation's external communications while having no actual authority to make decisions or commitments. Margaret had effectively abandoned her responsibilities, leaving Elena to field increasingly difficult questions from board members, donors, staff, and media representatives who were beginning to sense that something significant was happening behind the carefully maintained facade of the Ashworth Empire. James spent the morning reviewing the security footage from the past several days, not for any specific security concern, but to better understand the progression of Margaret's breakdown. What he saw in the recordings troubled him deeply. The cameras had captured not just the dramatic confrontations, but also the smaller moments, Margaret's agitated pacing, her increasingly animated phone conversations, the way her facial expressions had shifted from controlled intensity to barely contained rage. The footage revealed a pattern that James recognized from his military experience with personnel under extreme stress. Margaret was displaying classic signs of a psychological break, exacerbated by isolation, paranoia, and the immense pressure of maintaining her public persona. James realized that the situation had moved beyond a simple case of stress or difficult behavior and into territory that required professional intervention. Elena's phone rang constantly throughout the morning with calls from various stakeholders trying to understand what was happening with the foundation. Worded non-answers, explaining that Margaret was dealing with personal matters while the foundation's work continued as normal. These reassurances were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As evidence of the crisis leaked into the public sphere, the breaking point came at noon when Margaret finally emerged from her study. Elena's relief at seeing her was immediately replaced by alarm at Margaret's appearance. The older woman looked haggard, her usually immaculate hair disheveled, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them. But it was her eyes that truly frightened Elena. They burned with an intensity that seemed to border on the manic, and her movements had an erratic quality that suggested someone operating on the edge of control. Margaret's first action was to demand that Elena immediately contact a list of journalists and schedule interviews for that afternoon. She wanted to go public with her accusations about the conspiracy against the Foundation, convinced that media exposure would vindicate her position and expose her enemies. Elena tried to gently suggest that perhaps they should wait until they had more concrete evidence, but Margaret's response was swift and devastating. The verbal assault that followed was even more vicious than the previous day's confrontation. Margaret accused Elena of being part of the conspiracy, suggesting that her assistant had been systematically sabotaging the Foundation while pretending to be loyal. The accusations were wild and unfounded, but Margaret delivered them with such conviction that Elena found herself questioning whether there was some truth hidden within the paranoid delusions. James witnessed this confrontation from the hallway where he had been conducting his security rounds. He saw Elena's face crumple under the weight of Margaret's accusations, watched as the younger woman struggled to maintain her composure while being systematically destroyed by someone she had served faithfully for years. His protective instincts, honed by years of military service, prompted him to intervene. James entered the room with the calm authority that had made him effective in high-stress situations, his voice measured and professional as he attempted to redirect Margaret's attention to security matters that required her input. Margaret's response was to turn her full fury on him, accusing him of conspiring with Elena to undermine her authority and demanding that he leave the property immediately. The confrontation escalated rapidly, with Margaret's voice rising to a near shriek as she hurled accusations and threats at both Elena and James. She was no longer making any attempt to control her behavior or consider the consequences of her actions. The careful facade that had protected the Ashworth family's reputation for decades was crumbling in real time, and Elena realized that they were witnessing the complete destruction of everything Margaret had worked to build. James made a critical decision that would change the course of events. Recognizing that Margaret's behavior posed a potential threat to herself and others, he quietly activated his phone to record the confrontation. His work had taught him the importance of documentation in crisis situations, and his instincts told him that this footage might become crucial evidence if the situation continued to escalate. Margaret's rant continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which she accused Elena and James of everything from embezzlement to treason against the Ashworth family legacy. Her words were increasingly disconnected from reality, weaving together conspiracy theories that incorporated everyone from board members to household staff in an elaborate plot to destroy her life's work. Elena and James stood frozen, afraid that any movement or response might trigger an even more violent reaction. The tirade reached its peak when Margaret began making specific threats against people she believed had wronged her. She spoke about revenge, about consequences that would be swift and severe, about her ability to destroy careers and reputations with a single phone call. The threats were delivered with such venom that both Elena and James began to fear for the safety of the people Margaret had named. Elena tried once more to reach the rational woman she had worked with for 2 years, speaking in gentle tones about Margaret's need for rest and support. Margaret's response was to grab a heavy crystal paperweight from her desk and hurl it across the room, narrowly missing Elena's head before shattering against the wall. The action was so sudden and violent that both Elena and James stepped back, recognizing that Margaret had crossed the line from verbal aggression to physical danger. He pleaded himself between Margaret and Elena, his military training taking over as he assessed the threat level and began planning an exit strategy. Margaret seemed momentarily stunned by her own actions, staring at the shattered crystal as if she couldn't quite believe what she had done. The moment of clarity was brief, however, and she quickly resumed her accusations, now adding attempted assault to the list of consequences Elena would face. Elena felt her world collapsing around her as she realized that the woman she had respected and served was completely lost to paranoia and rage. Margaret was no longer the sophisticated strategic leader who had built the Foundation into a respected institution. She had become someone capable of violence, someone whose actions could put others at risk, someone who needed immediate professional intervention. James guided Elena toward the door, his movements calm and deliberate as he avoided triggering another violent outburst. Margaret screamed after them, her voice echoing through the manor as she hurled final accusations and threats. Elena could hear the sound of objects being thrown, of furniture being overturned, of a woman completely losing control of everything she had once commanded with absolute precision. The security cameras captured every moment of the confrontation, creating a permanent record of Margaret Ashworth's complete psychological breakdown. The footage showed not just the dramatic climax, but also the subtle progression that had led to this moment. The gradual erosion of self-control, the increasing paranoia, the transformation of a powerful woman into someone dangerous and unpredictable. Elena and James found themselves standing in the manor's grand foyer, both shaken by what they had witnessed. The sound of destruction continued from Margaret's study, punctuated by her increasingly incoherent screaming. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred and began to contemplate the impossible decisions that lay ahead. James was already thinking strategically about next steps. His security background had taught him to plan for contingencies, and he recognized that they were now dealing with a situation that required external intervention. Margaret's behavior had crossed every line of acceptable conduct, and her threats suggested that she might pose a danger to herself and others. If left unchecked, the afternoon brought a series of phone calls from board members, donors, and media representatives who had heard rumors about trouble at the foundation. Elena found herself in the impossible position of trying to protect Margaret's privacy while also ensuring that the foundation's work could continue. James monitored the security feeds, documenting Margaret's continued destructive behavior while trying to assess the risk to other staff members and visitors. As evening approached, Elena and James realized they were facing a moral and practical crisis that had no easy solutions. Derek. Margaret Ashworth, one of the most powerful women in their social sphere, was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown that threatened to destroy not only her own life, but also the lives and careers of everyone around her. The security footage that documented her collapse would become crucial evidence in the difficult decisions that lay ahead. The fourth day brought an eerie calm to Ashworth Manor, the kind of stillness that follows a devastating storm. Margaret had finally fallen silent sometime after midnight, though whether from exhaustion or a temporary return to lucidity was unclear. Elena and James had maintained their vigil throughout the night, taking turns monitoring the security feeds while trying to develop a strategy for managing the crisis that had engulfed them all. Elena sat in the library as dawn broke, surrounded by legal documents and foundation papers that she had been reviewing in an attempt to understand her options and obligations. The confidentiality agreements she had signed when taking the position were ironclad, binding her to absolute silence about the family's private affairs. Yet the events of the past few days had created a moral dilemma that transcended legal obligations. Margaret's behavior had become potentially dangerous, and Elena was struggling with her responsibility to protect others who might be at risk. James had spent the early morning hours carefully reviewing the security footage, creating a detailed timeline of Margaret's breakdown, and documenting the escalation from stress to paranoia to outright violence. The program had taught him the importance of thorough documentation in crisis situations, and his instincts told him that this evidence might become crucial for protecting both Margaret and those around her. The silence from Margaret's study was broken around 9 in the morning by the sound of her door opening. Elena and James both tensed, unsure of what version of Margaret would emerge, the controlled socialite they had known, or the paranoid violent woman they had witnessed the day before. What they encountered was somehow even more disturbing than either extreme. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the library, looking perfectly composed, her hair styled, her makeup applied with precision, her clothes immaculate. She greeted Elena and James as if nothing had happened, asking about the day's schedule and expressing mild irritation that no one had briefed her on the morning's appointments. The transformation was so complete that Elena wondered if she had imagined the previous day's events. There pictured Buckingham players and the concerns that had been raised by board members, watching carefully for Margaret's reaction. Margaret dismissed these issues with a wave of her hand, explaining that she had been dealing with a minor health issue that was now resolved. She seemed genuinely puzzled by Elena's obvious distress, asking if something was wrong and expressing concern for her assistant's well-being. James observed this interaction with growing alarm. Margaret's complete denial of recent events suggested either a profound disconnection from reality or a level of manipulation that was deeply calculating. Either possibility was troubling, and James recognized that they were now dealing with someone whose behavior was entirely unpredictable. Margaret's return to apparent normalcy lasted exactly 47 minutes. Elena had begun to hope that perhaps the crisis had passed, that Margaret had somehow worked through whatever psychological pressures had driven her to the breaking point. These hopes were shattered when Margaret received a phone call from a Foundation board member who was seeking clarification about the recent resignations and donor withdrawals. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Margaret's composed demeanor evaporated the moment she heard concern in the caller's voice, replaced by the same paranoid fury they had witnessed the day before. She began screaming accusations into the phone, demanding to know who had been spreading lies about her competence and threatening immediate retaliation against anyone who questioned her leadership. Writhed glances as Margaret's rant continued, realizing that the previous night's silence had not represented recovery but merely exhaustion. Margaret was cycling between periods of apparent normalcy and explosive rage, making her behavior even more unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The phone call ended with Margaret hurling her cell phone across the room, where it shattered against the marble fireplace. She turned to Elena with eyes that blazed with renewed suspicion, demanding to know what lies her assistant had been spreading during her absence from the public sphere. Elena's protestations of loyalty and concern were dismissed with increasing viciousness. James positioned himself strategically near the door, ready to intervene if Margaret's behavior escalated to violence again. His security training had taught him to recognize the warning signs of imminent aggression, and Margaret was displaying every indicator of someone about to lose complete control of their actions. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Margaret began accusing Elena of orchestrating the entire crisis as part of an elaborate scheme to take control of the Foundation. The accusations were wildly paranoid, but Margaret delivered them with such conviction that Elena found herself defending against charges that had no basis in reality. Margaret seemed to interpret Elena's denials as further evidence of guilt, creating a circular logic that trapped them both in an increasingly dangerous situation. James made a split-second decision that would have far-reaching consequences. As Margaret's accusations became more specific and more threatening, he quietly activated the hidden recording system on his phone, documenting not just Margaret's words but also the context and escalation of her breakdown. The footage captured the stark contrast between her moments of apparent lucidity and the explosive rage that followed any perceived challenge to her authority. Margaret's rant reached a new level of intensity when she began making specific threats against people she believed had conspired against her. She spoke about having enough power to destroy careers, ruin reputations, and ensure that her enemies faced consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The threats were delivered with such detailed malice that both Elena and James began to fear for the safety of the people she was targeting. Picture, Elena tried desperately to reach some remaining fragment of the rational woman she had served for 2 years, speaking in calm, measured tones about Margaret's need for rest and medical attention. Margaret's response was swift and violent. She grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk and pointed it at Elena, her hands shaking with rage as she screamed about betrayal and consequences. James moved immediately, his military training taking over as he assessed the weapon threat and positioned himself to protect Elena while trying to de-escalate the situation. Margaret turned the letter opener toward him, her voice rising to a shriek as she accused him of being part of the conspiracy and demanded that he leave her property immediately. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour, with Margaret cycling between periods of threatening behavior and moments of apparent confusion about why Elena and James seemed so frightened. She seemed genuinely puzzled by their defensive postures, as if she couldn't remember grabbing the weapon or making the threats that had triggered their protective responses. Elena felt her heart breaking as she watched someone she had respected and admired completely lose touch with reality. Margaret was no longer the sophisticated strategic leader who had built the Foundation into a respected institution. She had become someone capable of violence, someone whose judgment was so impaired that she posed a danger to herself and everyone around her. James recognized that the situation had reached a point where external intervention was not just advisable but necessary. Margaret's behavior had escalated beyond anything that could be managed through internal resources, and her threats suggested that she might act on her paranoid delusions in ways that could harm innocent people. The decision to seek help was complicated by the web of confidentiality agreements, legal obligations, and social expectations that surrounded the Ashworth family. Elena knew that any public revelation of Margaret's condition would destroy not only her personal reputation, but also the Foundation's ability to continue its charitable work. Yet the alternative, Allowing Margaret to continue her downward spiral without intervention seemed to pose even greater risks. As afternoon turned to evening, Elena and James found themselves trapped between loyalty and responsibility, between their obligation to protect Margaret's privacy and their duty to ensure the safety of everyone who might be affected by her increasingly erratic behavior. Feet continued to accumulate, creating an undeniable record of a woman in complete psychological crisis, while the two people who cared most about her struggled with impossible choices about her future. Margaret spent the late afternoon barricaded in her study again, her voice carrying through the door as she made increasingly agitated phone calls to people who were clearly struggling to understand her rambling accusations and demands for immediate action. Elena and James realized that Margaret was systematically destroying relationships that had taken decades to build, burning bridges with allies who had supported the family through both triumph and tragedy. The weight of the crisis was beginning to affect both Elena and James, who had been operating under extreme stress for days while trying to manage a situation that seemed to have no resolution. Elena felt the crushing burden of watching someone she respected destroy herself while being powerless to intervene effectively. James was struggling with the tactical aspects of the crisis, trying to balance his protective instincts with the complex legal and ethical considerations that governed his relationship with the family. As night fell over Ashworth Manor, the building that had once been a symbol of stability and success had become a prison holding three people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Guard continued her isolated rants. Elena grappled with decisions that could determine the future of multiple lives and institutions, and James documented evidence that might become crucial to resolving a crisis that threatened to consume everything in its path. The fifth day at Ashworth Manor began with a silence so profound that Elena initially feared the worst. Margaret had not emerged from her study, and no sounds had been heard from behind the locked door since the previous evening. Elena stood outside the heavy oak door, listening intently for any sign of movement while wrestling with the decision that she and James had been forced to make during the long, sleepless night. James had spent hours reviewing the accumulated security footage, creating a comprehensive documentation of Margaret's psychological breakdown that would serve multiple purposes. The video evidence showed not only the dramatic confrontations but also the subtle progression of Margaret's condition, the escalating paranoia, and the increasing danger she posed to herself and others. Most importantly, it provided irrefutable proof that intervention was not only justified but necessary. Elena's phone had been ringing constantly since dawn with calls from board members, donors, media representatives, and foundation staff who were becoming increasingly concerned about Margaret's absence from scheduled meetings and public appearances. The careful facade that had protected the Ashworth family's privacy was crumbling, and Elena realized that they had perhaps hours before the crisis became public knowledge. The decision to contact Dr. a psychiatrist who specialized in crisis intervention for high-profile individuals had not been made lightly. Elena had found Dr. Mitchell's contact information in Margaret's personal files, along with notes suggesting that Charles Ashworth had consulted with her during his final illness about his wife's emotional state. The discovery had provided both hope and legal justification for seeking professional help. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the manor at 10 in the morning, accompanied by a small team that included a security specialist and a legal advisor who were experienced in managing sensitive situations involving prominent families. Elena and James briefed her thoroughly on the events of the past week, providing both their first-hand accounts and selected portions of the security footage that documented Margaret's deteriorating condition. Dr. Appreciator. Mitchell's assessment was swift and professional. Based on the evidence provided and her experience with similar cases, she confirmed what Elena and James had already suspected. Margaret was experiencing a severe psychological crisis that required immediate intervention. The combination of extreme stress, social isolation, and possible underlying mental health issues had created a perfect storm that threatened not only Margaret's well-being but also the safety of everyone around her. The challenge lay in convincing Margaret to accept help voluntarily, as her episodes of apparent lucidity made involuntary commitment legally complicated. Dr. Mitchell's strategy was to approach Margaret during one of her calmer periods, presenting the intervention as a temporary measure to help her deal with the stress of managing the foundation rather than as treatment for mental illness. 30. Elena knocked softly on Margaret's door, using the gentle tone that had sometimes been effective during the crisis. To everyone's relief, Margaret responded coherently, though her voice carried an undertone of exhaustion that suggested she was operating on the edge of collapse. Elena carefully explained that a consultant was available to help with foundation management issues, presenting Dr. Mitchell as a strategic advisor rather than a mental health professional. Margaret emerged from her study looking surprisingly composed, though closer inspection revealed the strain she had been under. Her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, her hands trembled slightly, and her usual confident posture had given way to a more tentative bearing. With polite interest, seemingly unaware that her behavior over the past week had been anything but normal. Dr. Mitchell's approach was masterful in its subtlety. He began by discussing the legitimate challenges facing the foundation, acknowledging the real pressures that Margaret had been dealing with while gradually introducing questions about stress management and coping strategies. Margaret responded well initially, seeming grateful for someone who understood the magnitude of her responsibilities. The conversation proceeded carefully for nearly an hour, with Dr. Mitchell gradually building trust while assessing Margaret's mental state through carefully crafted questions and observations. Elena and James remained nearby but out of direct sight, ready to intervene if Margaret's behavior became threatening but hoping that professional expertise might succeed where their efforts had failed. The turning point came when Dr. Mitchell gently suggested that Margaret might benefit from a short residential program designed to help high-achieving individuals manage stress and develop better coping strategies. Margaret's initial response was positive, but as the implications of the suggestion became clear, her demeanor began to shift ominously. Dodge. Elena watched with growing dread as Margaret's expression changed from interested consideration to suspicious scrutiny. She began asking pointed questions about Dr. Mitchell's credentials, her connection to the Foundation's board members, and whether Elena had been involved in arranging the consultation. The paranoid thought patterns that had driven her behavior all week were reasserting themselves with frightening speed. Dr. Mitchell maintained her professional composure as Margaret's questions became more aggressive and accusatory. She attempted to redirect the conversation back to stress management techniques, but Margaret was now fully alert to what she perceived as another attempt to undermine her authority. The facade of rational discussion crumbled rapidly as Margaret's voice rose and her accusations became more specific and more vicious. Elena felt her heart sink as Margaret launched into a familiar tirade about conspiracies and betrayal, now expanded to include Dr. Mitchell as part of the elaborate plot against the Foundation. The psychiatrist's presence seemed to validate all of Margaret's paranoid fears about people trying to have her declared incompetent so they could seize control of her life's work. James positioned himself strategically as Margaret's behavior escalated, recognizing the warning signs that had preceded her previous violent outbursts. Dr. Mitchell's security specialist also moved into position, his experience with volatile individuals evident in his calm but alert posture. Margaret seemed to sense the coordinated response to her agitation, which only increased her conviction that she was surrounded by enemies. The situation reached a crisis point when Margaret demanded that everyone leave her property immediately, threatening to call the police and have them arrested for trespassing and conspiracy. Her voice had risen to a near shriek, and she was gesturing wildly as she hurled accusations that became increasingly disconnected from reality. Dr. Mitchell continued her attempts at de-escalation, but Margaret was beyond the reach of rational persuasion. Elena made the most difficult decision of her professional life. Despite her loyalty to Margaret and her commitment to protecting the family's privacy, she gave Dr. Mitchell permission to proceed with involuntary commitment procedures based on Margaret's threats to herself and others. The decision felt like a betrayal of everything she had promised when she took the job, but Elena could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that Margaret posed a genuine danger. Dr. Mitchell's legal advisor had been preparing the necessary documentation throughout the morning, and within minutes, a court order was obtained authorizing a 72-hour psychiatric hold based on the evidence of Margaret's threatening behavior and her apparent inability to care for herself safely. The process was handled with the discretion that such high-profile cases required, but the outcome was the same. Margaret would be receiving professional treatment whether she wanted it or not. Margaret's reaction to the arrival of the commitment team was explosive and heartbreaking. She screamed about betrayal, about the destruction of everything Charles had built, about the conspiracy that had finally succeeded in destroying her. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Margaret being gently but firmly escorted from the manor, her voice echoing through the halls as she hurled final accusations at everyone present. The immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath would be complex and far-reaching. Elena found herself in temporary control of the Foundation's operations, working with the board to develop a public statement about Margaret's temporary absence due to health issues. The careful language protected both Margaret's privacy and the Foundation's reputation while buying time for longer-term solutions to be developed. James secured all the security footage that documented Margaret's breakdown, recognizing that it would be crucial evidence for both legal proceedings and treatment planning. The video record provided irrefutable proof of Margaret's deteriorating condition and justified the intervention that had ultimately saved her from potentially catastrophic consequences of her actions. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary assessment suggested that Margaret's condition was treatable with proper medication and therapy. The recovery would be a long process requiring significant lifestyle changes and ongoing support. The Foundation would continue its work under interim leadership while Margaret focused on her health and well-being. Elena spent the evening walking through the now quiet halls of Ashworth Manor, processing the events that had transformed her from a loyal assistant into someone who had been forced to make decisions about another person's fundamental freedom. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but she took comfort in knowing that Margaret would receive the professional help she desperately needed. The security cameras that had silently documented every moment of the crisis would become part of the legal record, providing evidence that the intervention had been necessary and appropriate. The footage showed not only Margaret's breakdown, but also the careful, responsible way that Elena and James had handled an impossible situation with courage and compassion. As night fell over Ashworth Manor, the building began its slow return to normalcy. Margaret would spend the coming weeks in a secure treatment facility, working with professionals to address the underlying issues that had contributed to her crisis. Elena would continue managing the Foundation's operations, guided by the principles and vision that Margaret had established during her years of effective leadership. The crisis had tested everyone involved, revealing both the fragility of human psychology under extreme pressure and the strength that ordinary people can find when faced with extraordinary challenges. Elena and James had navigated an impossible situation with integrity and wisdom, making difficult decisions that ultimately served the best interests of someone they cared about deeply. The Foundation would survive and eventually thrive again, its mission intact even as its leadership evolved. Margaret's story would serve as a reminder that even the most capable and successful people can face psychological challenges that require professional intervention, and that seeking help is a sign of strength rather than weakness. The security footage that captured Margaret's breakdown would remain sealed, protecting her privacy while serving as evidence that the intervention had been both necessary and compassionate. The manor would eventually welcome Margaret back when she was ready, transformed by treatment and supported by people who had proven their loyalty through the most difficult circumstances imaginable.